I take this as a privilege to share my congratulations with the students who are graduating this year. In fact, they graduated in 2020 June, but for some reasons which is known to us, that the commissioning service is being postponed to this date. So this is my privilege to share with you words of encouragement as you venture into the ministry. Before I do that one, I would like to thank the Vice President of the Board of Governors of Kerala United Theological Seminary, Right Reverend Dr. Uyman George, the Principal of KUTS, Reverend Dr. C.I. David Joy, members of the faculty, bishops of Church of South India, leaders of the church, pastors, and my dear students. Indeed, I count it a privilege to be part of you this afternoon. Many of you may have already joined the ministry and started your ministry. Some may be waiting for posting. However, this is one ritual that we find in the seminary after your 4 years. When you move into the ministry, the seminary commissions you into the ministry for which you are called, or the ministry to which you have dedicated yourself. It may be a church, it may be a Christian organization, it may be a social work, it may be teaching, it may be different kinds of programs. But what is important is to think why we are called and why we needed to prepare ourselves in last 4 years in order to be faithful to the call. I have chosen the text which was read before you is Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verses 1 to 10. We still do not know who is the author. It is always attributed to King Solomon. But always the wisdom sayers always shared their bit of knowledge through their experience about the world. Now, chapter 11 is a text that not only gives you gloom and doom on the face of the earth, it also tells you that nothing appears to be normal to our eyes. Today, the world is speaking of new normal. To me, the new normal is the same old abnormal. Because what was new normal preceded with the history of normal. What is going to be new normal is followed by a kind of new context that are emerging. And in between 2020 year is a transiting point. History is cyclic. It repeats itself because sometimes the history takes the new forms in the process as it moves to the future. Attack of infection and viruses are not new to us. As human, as part of the creation, we have several challenges of health. We have learned the great Spain virus that had created a catastrophe in the world in the year 1918. It is believed more than 50 million people died of Spain virus. 100 years later, we are facing the same situation. The book of Exodus, particularly chapter 11, reminds us of three things. The first four verses tells us be prepared for any eventuality. There is nothing new as you read the entire Ecclesiastes. Everything under the sun is vanity. It exists, it continues to exist, it creates challenges, it continues to create challenge. Then verses 5 and 6 tells us that we ought to remind ourselves that God is the source of life. He is in control. God is the beginning and the end. Through God, we have the life, and through God, we live the life. The later part of Ecclesiastes chapter 11, particularly verses 7 onward, it says, what ought to be the alternative? What should we do? How do we respond as human? The wisdom writer reminds us that we need to be cheerful in heart like a young person. Being cheerful is to do what is right. Being cheerful is to know the will of God. Being cheerful is to take up the responsibility and task that God has kept for us. In other words, if we want to enjoy or celebrate life, we need to remember that celebration of life comes when we are right in the eyes of God. So my homily for the commissioning service would be different had it not been COVID-19 pandemic. If I were asked to preach in March 2020, my sermon would have been totally different. The reason why I say this one is because, dear young friends, as you go into the ministry, you have greater challenge. You are not going to carry any longer the traditions that have existed, but you have to evolve new thinking to give life and vigor to the church and to Christian witness. Today, my homily is certainly going to be different because we are into a new normal. The church is forced to adapt things that were never thought of seriously by the church and the leaders of the church. In the new normal, one thing that comes to our mind as I speak through online, that online church has come to stay. That the question is whether this is going to replace the on-site church. A church is a virtual reality, and the worship now takes place virtually. We all see each other, we all hear each other, we worship together, but maintaining social distances and physical touch. The church is going through a new reality, and that reality is nothing but virtual reality. It's a new normal situation. A church has to engage with kind of situation where church has to really understand her role and responsibility. But I'm not talking of the church as institution or church as a structure, but I'm talking of a church belonging to people who name themselves as the community of Christ and the follower of Jesus Christ. So church has entered into a new reality, which appears to be virtual reality, and this is going to stay. How do you respond to such kind of situations as young pastors and ministers of the church? You will have to do counseling online. You have to pray over the phone. You have to share communion where you will not hand it over, but the members sitting in far and distant places will take symbolically the bread and the wine to celebrate in the communion table. The church is no more going to be confined to a locality, to a radius of 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers. Church is out there in the ends of the earth. And this makes the gospel mandate, God's, Jesus' commission to his disciples. Go to the end of the earth, to the margins, to the peripheries, to the edges, to the places where physically it is not possible to reach. So it is a new normal for the church. Do you have to come to worship in a church? Will be the question that might emerge after the pandemic is over. How do you balance the on-site church and the online church? Is there a continuity of the two in two parallel way, or there is a point where they come together and share as life that needs to be offered? It is not only the church that is going to face the challenges. Friends, you have just completed your 2 years and 4 years of theological education, and you are going to the church and to the ministry. It's a new theological thinking. It's a new theological discourse. Probably you may not have been prepared with the new situation. The new situation brings a new theological discourses, theological dialogues, theological thinking. In this kind of theological thinking, probably what you have learned in the seminary, in the classroom for last 4 years, may have relevance, but then it depends how you interpret those that you have learned in your classroom in the new situation, in the new context. For example, we were talking of ecological concerns, how to preserve our ecosystem, how to sustain the earth, how to control the global temperature. But never we had really thought seriously of health hazards that comes through the virus and bacteria or germs. In this new discourse, how do you respond to the nature? During this period, the theological discourse also has extended to the lives. One of the common thing that comes to our mind is the Black Lives Matter. George Floyd, the one who was killed by two police officers when he was struggling to breathe and asking them to leave him because he was breathless. He was killed. The lives matter, whether it's a black or white or brown or gray, whether it's a high caste or low caste, lives matter. Life does not distinguish. Life, as God's source of creation, comes to us without any discrimination. God offers lives to everyone. As human, we are asked to tend the life that God has given, not only to us and also to others in our community, in our neighborhood, both in the nature, human, as well as in other beings. Dear friends, having said all that, I just want to say in this kind of pandemic, we are left with no option but to think of alternatives. Think of our families. The family is in transition. Many would say that, the family has been able to spend time productively as a family. Never before father was at home more than 1 or 2 hours. Never before the entire family was worshiping together, praying together. Never before the family was dining together. But today, what we see is there is a value in living as a family. But at the same time, let us also know that the domestic violence is increased in the family. The There is also a discord that has come because of loss of jobs, loss of resources. I think this is where the ministry has become a challenge. It is not only to the ministry, to the church and community, but also to the family and to the individuals. Young people and children have lost one precious year. Some of them have lost their jobs. Some of them have lost 1 year of their education. Others who are doing online classes also have lost a precious year of learning because there is less mobility. But these are also challenges to us. The Christian ministry that is awaiting for us as we start entering into with new reality, with new challenges. How do we address all these challenges? What are our pastoral roles in this kind of situations? I think we as ministers of the church, we are called to teach the whole church. Going beyond the walls of our church. Church is out there. Church is in public places. Church today is in market. Because if you have a smartphone device, you can worship where you are. You don't have to come to the church. So the urgency for us is to teach the whole church, not confining the church to the four walls of a compound or a building, but it is a church that is out there. Secondly, What would be our message to the church? One thing we must have realized, those of us who have preached the homilies through online, that you have to do an extra efforts preparing a sermon well and making a presentations, because they are all recorded and people are listening intensely. Gone are the days when you can preach anything from the pulpit. Today, everyone listens very carefully and they record and re-listen whatever the pastor preaches. So our homily ought to be relevant. It has to be prepared and delivered according to the context, because the congregation is listening. Are we inclusive in our preaching? Do we have gender justice when we preach, or we leave the women folk from our preachings? Are we preaching just and equitable society? Are we preaching something where we talk of God's democracy of equality, economic equality, eco-justice? I think the whole scope of homily is now broadened, because today the church want to listen how they need to engage themselves in a society, in a community, outside the compound of the church, in a church which is active not only on Sunday, but from Monday to Sunday, 7 days activity. The church got to be a witnessing community. I think the witness aspect has become much more relevant today, because when we share the gospel, others are hearing. I'm told many non-Christians also sit in this kind of worship to listen what we speak. So the witnessing aspect of the church has grown bigger. As pastors, how do we really understand the ministry as we enter? To me, pastors should be creatively thinking to overcome the challenges. We cannot simply stay in the past. We cannot simply always say, okay, traditions are important. We need to change according to the perception of the world. We need to change according to the context, not changing the gospel while we keep the essence of the gospel. We need to really make our gospel relevant. But pastor should be a facilitator, a catalyst in offering spiritual nurture as well as leadership through others. Church must become, in this post-pandemic, the priesthood of all believers, what we call in sociological term, democracy of the equals. Christian terms, it is priesthood of all believers, that we enable and empower every member of the church to be a kind of performing the priestly function, not necessarily what we talk of that liturgy tradition as such, but then as a believer in Christ. Dear friends, at the end, I just want to say, post pandemic, there is always a hope, there is always a life, there is always a liberation. The act of God is always leading us to receive the salvation that is offered to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Let us carry out the task of liberation to the people who are out there. The gospel's mandate is to fulfill the Great Commission, go to the end of the earth and bring life and offer life through Jesus Christ. May all we be blessed as we enter into ministry. This post pandemic may bring an alternative church a church out there where it is not only the members, not only the Christian followers, but also others be part of it. May God bless you and help you as you enter into ministry. Amen.